All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So my name is Allison Yakno. I'm a planner for the Shenango County Planning Department. So our main idea in hosting this training was to, educate the local municipalities on how to best site their solar, in the best way possible to better accommodate the municipality as well as the solar companies, and then of course the residents of the municipality. So as a part of our Clean Energy Communities initiative that we have been working on over the last couple of years, we have been dedicated to become a more climate efficient community. And in that program, we are looking at completing a bunch of different actions that in return get the county grant money. So for example, we completed the Solarize campaign, which was a community solar last year. And out of that, we were able to receive a $15,000 grant. And we are working on that right now to be implemented to upgrade to LED lighting. So as a part of this training, we are looking to get points, and the more people that are involved in it, the more educated they're going to be about the different projects. And as of right now, we have one more training scheduled. That is going to be April 20th from 6 to 8, and that is going to be on your clean energy and your comprehensive plan. And I will send an email out to all the attendees, reminding them of that, and then get the Zoom link out. So with that, I'll turn it over to Bill, and we'll get started.
Great, thank you, Allison, and thanks to Shenango County for hosting, and thanks for all of you for joining. My name is Bill Obercare. I'm a project manager on NYSERDA's Clean Energy Siting team. Tonight, I'm going to take you through our model solar zoning law. But I just want to caveat everything that I'm saying tonight in this presentation by letting you know that there is a new iteration of the solar law that's coming out soon. I actually just got an email at 5:55 tonight saying that that new document went to NYSERDA's marketing team today. So we're probably looking at a month or so until there's a new version. Because that's not out yet, we haven't updated these slides. So I'm going to be referencing the next iteration of the model law throughout the presentation, just doing it aloud. And I'll let you know what things are changing for the next iteration. And if I don't say anything, it's probably going to stay the same. But I think it's helpful to start out by framing the effort here. The reason we expect to see increased solar proliferation throughout New York State is because in 2019, the New York legislature passed the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. It's also known as the CLCPA, also known as the Climate Act. I'm probably going to use those terms interchangeably. So what this does is sets electricity sector goals of 70% renewables by 2030 with an 100% emissions-free grid by 2040. As a part of that, we have technology-specific goals of 10,000 megawatts of distributed solar by 2025. I'll get into what distributed solar is versus utility solar later in the presentation. Also important to note that that goal up until very recently was 6,000 megawatts distributed solar by 2025. But the state exceeded that goal early, so saw fit to raise the goal by another 4 gigawatts. So that has recently been raised to 10,000 megawatts. We've also got 9 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2035. And then we've got 3,000 megawatts of energy storage by 2030 with an interim goal of 1.5 gigawatts by 2025. So those are the main goals laid out by the Climate Act. There are also some socioeconomic components to the act. Notably, at least 35% of the benefits from renewables have to go to what's called disadvantaged communities. You can find more about that on the Climate Action Council website, which, by the way, the Climate Act also created the Climate Action Council. But I don't want to belabor the Climate Act. I do want to draw folks' attention to this graph down at the bottom. This is New York State's energy mix. I've found in my years of doing this that not nearly enough folks are familiar with the term or the idea of an energy mix. So I want to take the time to lay that out for everyone. So this is up to 2017, so it's a bit dated. But as you can see, our electricity comes from a variety of different sources. And that has been true since at least the 80s. It's been true for longer than that. So what we want to see going forward is you can see that the coal is already pretty much phased out of our energy mix. Natural gas has taken on a larger share in those years. But what we really want to see with this 100% emissions-free grid by 2040 is higher proliferation of renewables, hydro, and just zero emissions electricity. One thing I want to note about this graph here is if you see the nuclear going up to 2017 is a sizable portion of the energy mix. Folks may be aware that the Indian Point nuclear facility in Westchester has been it's been decommissioning in stages. So here in 2022, now that I believe a third of that plant has been decommissioned. I might be getting that number wrong, but the decommissioning of Indian Point has started, so we have less nuclear in our energy mix now than we did when this image or when this graph was made. I just like to lead off with this to kind of frame the effort and just zoom out all the way to talk about, why are we seeing solar in the first place? Why is it coming into our communities? And I guess for Shenango, it's been in the community for a while. So from a land use perspective, we're not terribly worried about rooftop residential solar, right? There's not really a land use impact there. The land use impact is from the house that it's sitting on. We'll get more in depth into that later in the presentation, but I just want to frame really the two types of solar that we're going to be concerned about from a land use perspective. One is the solar that's procured through NYSERDA's large-scale renewables program. This is the program where NYSERDA bids for renewable energy contracts for large generating assets. You can see a map here of the 2020 awards. 2020 was the last batch of awards. We'll get to the 2021 proposals on the next slide, but you can see we've got 22 large-scale renewable energy projects awarded in the year 2020, including 21 solar farms, 3 of which feature energy storage. There's one hydroelectric upgrade up there in the North Country that's going to generate enough electricity to power more than 530,000 homes, going to reduce carbon emissions by more than 2 million metric tons, which is equivalent to taking about 440,000 cars off the road. And we're going to create over 3,100 short and long-term well-paying jobs. And that's all through this 2020 solicitation. So one thing that comes up a lot with this program is folks, I have found in my travels throughout the state that folks tend to assume that when NYSERDA awards a project, that means that the project is permitted and it's going to be built. That is not the case. NYSERDA is just entering an agreement to buy the renewable energy credits from that project should it get built. Renewable energy credits are the unique legal claim to the environmental attributes of the energy generated by clean energy resources. Folks may be aware, we're not going to get too deep into it because it's a whole presentation in itself, but folks may be aware of the Office of Renewable Energy Siting that was created in 2020 at the state level. That's going to be the permitting authority for projects that are permitted through the state. NYSERDA is not a permitting authority. NYSERDA's relationship to these projects is to purchase the environmental attributes of the energy that's generated. We've got another map here. These are the 2021 large-scale renewable proposals. So as I said, we still haven't awarded the 2021 projects. Would expect that to come imminently. Obviously, we're a bit late on that announcement. But these are the proposed projects. Not all of these dots on the map are going to be awarded by any means. But this is, kind of the overall realm of possibility, which will be narrowed down when the awards are announced. would probably happen within a month or two. So that's the large scale renewables program. These are going to be technically 7.5 megawatts or greater. Typically though, these projects are going to be 20 megawatts or greater, sometimes even up to like 100 to 200 megawatts, just depending on, site control and a variety of other factors. These projects are connected directly to New York's transmission infrastructure through the New York State Independent System Operator, or the NISO. So these projects are designed to kind of shoot power around the state. That's why they're very large. And they're on the transmission infrastructure. And the way that they get compensated is the wholesale price of electricity, known as a strike price. So the large scale renewables, that's a program, and that is where all the very big projects like that, the mega farms, the mega solar farms exist. And we've got NY Sun, on the other hand, which is where you see projects that we call community solar. And we'll get into what that is. But the NY Sun initiative was created, I believe, in 2013 or 14, so it's been a while now. About $1 billion to start. I think that number has since increased. We still have the old statewide goal of 6 gigawatts by 2025, as I said on the first slide. Since we have exceeded that, we're up to 10 gigawatts now. And the goal of this program and the goal of these incentives is to create a self-sustaining market. And so the incentives for solar in New York State have decreased over time. The incentives are measured in cents per watt. So the cents per watt subsidy or incentive decreases as the market matures. The idea being that as the solar industry gets more practice at what they're doing, they get better at it, become more efficient, and they have less need for incentives to make their projects work. Through the years of the New York Sun program, that has proven to be true. That is exactly how things worked out, so much so that we exceeded the 6 gigawatt goal well ahead of time, enough to raise that to 10 gigawatts. I want to talk about community solar because, as I mentioned, from a land use perspective, we're primarily concerned with two different types of installations. The large scale renewables, which are the mega solar farms, and community solar is probably more in line with just what you would consider a regular solar farm. Here's a ribbon cutting for a solar farm in New York. Just have this in here so you can get a feel for the size, especially the height. Figure some of these people are around 6 feet tall. You can see the highest point of the solar is above their heads, and just the amount of space that's taken up with the solar array. So how does community solar work? Solar panels are going to be installed off-site, typically in a field somewhere. They're going to generate renewable energy that's going to flow directly onto the utility's distribution grid. Any utility customer within that utility territory can sign up to purchase the credits from that power, and then the power generated is then credited to those utility accounts, reducing the price of the customer's energy bill. Saying the same thing a little bit differently here to help clarify. So we've got solar panels installed at a place somewhere within utility territory. That is then connected directly to that utility's distribution grid. So what we call front of the meter. That's the same thing as being connected directly to the grid, not servicing an on-site load. That energy is going to flow out onto the distribution grid. People who have signed up, or subscribers to that community solar array, are then going to basically agree to purchase the energy that's generated. One thing I like to clarify here too, from an electrical engineering perspective, it's not like I will agree to purchase the energy from this community solar installation that may be 25 miles away from my house. It's not like there's a way for the utility to route that power directly to your house. it's more of like some spreadsheet magic that's happening. The solar array is generating so much electricity. The utility is tracking that electricity, and then they're allocating those credits to different utility bills. That's how it works. Electrons are just going to follow the path of least resistance when they're on the utility grid. So they'll go to wherever the load is that is most closely located to where the generation is. Just want to get into solar guidebook for local governments and the clean energy siting team to let you know that we are here to help out in a more in-depth way than this. So NYSERDA offers free one-on-one technical assistance to local governments throughout the state on the following subject areas: adopting a payment in lieu of taxes or pilot law and agreement, the seeker process, state environmental quality review for large solar installations, planning and zoning, such as adopting the model solar energy law, which we'll hear all about tonight. We also have some resources and for technical assistance on balancing agricultural needs and solar development and comprehensive planning, which we have on the docket for April 20th. I would urge folks to attend that training if you're interested in incorporating clean energy into your comprehensive plan. We also help out with municipal solar procurement and permitting and inspection, including the handy unified solar permit, which you also get some points and maybe even some money, I think, for adopting the unified solar permit through the Clean Energy Communities program. So folks may look into that too if you're pursuing Clean Energy Communities points. Clean Energy Siting Team can be reached through our homepage or cleanenergyhelp@nyserda.ny.gov. That's really the best way to reach my whole team. That inbox is monitored by everyone on my team simultaneously. So if you email that with a request, we'll get back to you. Typically, we can do it pretty quickly, usually within a day or two. But if you are either a municipal official, local government official, or say a municipal attorney or someone acting on behalf of a municipality, we do ask that you let us know that in the email that you send us, because we do prioritize those technical assistance requests. We also get requests from citizens, from industry, from a wide variety of stakeholders. Our main focus, though, is local governments, so it's very helpful for us if you are reaching out to us for technical assistance or training to let us know what municipality you're from, what local government you're from, and we can then prioritize your request and make sure that we're getting to it quickly. My team, the Clean Energy Siting Team, is also responsible for the New York Solar Guidebook for local governments. Some of you may be familiar with this. So I'm not going to read all the chapters here, but wanted to call your attention to Chapter 10, the Model Solar Energy Local Law. That's what we're going to be talking about tonight. You can see this whole law, download this whole law, Word or PDF, I believe, by going to the Solar Guidebook and just opening that chapter. These all function as an accordion menu when you're on the Solar Guidebook landing page. So each one, you click on a chapter and it will open up, and there will be a variety of resources under each one of these chapters. So I would urge folks to maybe even now, it could be helpful to pull this up and look at it as we're going through, but certainly later, it's definitely worth taking some time one-on-one with the Model Solar Energy Law and really trying to dig into it. Without further ado, let's talk about the Model Solar Energy Law. I see there are some questions. I think it probably makes sense to handle them at the end, but I would encourage you to keep them coming, just because it can be, I understand that it can be hard to hang on to them. We can go through the chat at the end, so I don't want you to stop putting them in as they come to you. Just know that I probably will not jump out of the presentation to address them until we get to the end of the show. So what is the Model Solar Energy Law? It's an all-inclusive ordinance that's intended to provide a thorough review of all aspects of solar energy systems that could be regulated via zoning. It's a template document, so there are places where you can just kind of fill in your personal information for your municipality. The law also gives municipalities flexibilities to choose options that work the best in some cases. But ultimately, you're going to want to review the model law, examine your local situation, and adopt regulations that make the most sense locally. You are free to add, delete, modify, whatever you want to do to this model law template. Think of it as a starting point. You can simply fill in all of the highlighted areas and pass that as a zoning law. I would recommend digging into it a little bit more deeply than that. You can add things, delete things, modify things as you see fit. That is, as a home real estate, we are allowed to do that. There are a few things it would do well to take a look at before going into drafting a law. A good one is a hosting capacity map. This is NYSEG or RG&E, just because I think that their map is a great example. It's really clear. So I like to use this in the slides to just kind of illustrate the concept. Every utility in New York State was ordered by the Department of Public Service to create one of these hosting capacity maps. They will give you this type of information. The way that it's packaged is different, but it's always going to be about the same information. There's also more information than this hidden in layers of the hosting capacity map. It's not hidden. All you have to do is click or hover in some cases. But I'm just highlighting these pieces of information to kind of show what I mean by doing this as a pre-screening for a land use, from a land use perspective and before you do zoning. You can see a red circuit typically means you're not going to be able, or that piece of the grid is not going to be able to accommodate much more electricity generation. So that's not going to be a great candidate for solar development. Yellow circuits, you're going to have, it's like a stoplight. You're going to have a little bit better odds at being able to interconnect that solar array without costly upgrades to the grid. And going back to the previous slide, we have some blue and green. That's going to be your greatest level of capacity. I forgot to point this out. I'm sorry. Over here, we have, blue is going to be able to accommodate greater than 5 megawatts, down to red being, between 0 and 1/4 megawatt, and everything in between color coded, so that the utility is communicating that clearly. This is a pre-screening tool. This is not a guarantee from the utility that you will be able to put that much generation on that circuit. This is just to kind of demystify interconnection processes and give you some idea of where you can expect the solar industry to target their development. What you want to glean from this information and why I use this as an example to this day. You can see here we've got a maximum total feeder hosting capacity of 0.5 megawatt. We've got 0.15 megawatts installed right now. And then we've got 3.84 megawatts in the queue. And that's on this circuit right here. I'm not sure if you can see this arrow. So what that means is we have a maximum of 0.5 megawatt. We've already got 0.15 installed, and we've got 3.84 waiting to be installed. So that 3.84 megawatts is not likely to get built because you've exceeded that threshold. And in order to be able to build that, projects in excess of what that circuit can handle, solar developers are going to have to pay for costly grid infrastructure upgrades, which, oftentimes, I would say more often than not, just make the projects not viable from an economic standpoint. So it's just kind of one of one of the really in the weeds, more technical things that you can do is sort of a pre-law development activity is to take a look at your hosting capacity map to give yourself an idea of where the grid can support incoming renewable development, and kind of chart that out while you're thinking about your zoning regulations. Few other things that are best practices before drafting your solar energy law. Amend your comprehensive plan. You can do that concurrently or before, and make sure that you include a clear and well-defined municipal-wide strategy for solar development. Some folks may know this, but zoning regulations, land use regulations are enabled by a comprehensive plan. So any zoning or land use laws that aren't rooted in a comprehensive plan are not legal, and they are vulnerable to challenges in court. So it's very important to have that comprehensive plan in place before you start implementing zoning laws for solar or for anything else. Second pre-development or pre-draft activity is to conduct outreach in the community to gather all available ideas, identify divergent groups and views, and secure support from the entire community. Folks probably know solar is increasingly contentious in some parts of the state. You know, we don't want to expect that everyone is 100% on board with solar development in their community. That is not going to be the case. It doesn't matter what part of the state you're operating in. I know from plenty of experience. So it's good to find out how the community feels about solar, where folks in the community would like to see solar development, where are the non-starters for solar development. Really great to have a feel of those things or a sense of those things before drafting the law. And then finally, you want to create a working group that will conduct meetings on a community-wide basis and do studies to determine whether existing policies, plan, and land use regulations require amendments to remove barriers to and facilitate your solar energy development goals. So this working group is really going to be kind of the workhorse. You want a reliable team of folks who really understand the subject matter to be looking at policies and regulations to be sure that they support your comprehensive plan. So now we've got our pre-development, pre-draft activities out of the way. I'm going to take us through the law itself. These are the sections. Some of these I'm going to speed through a little bit just because there's not that much to say about them. That doesn't mean that they're not important. It just means that there's not much to elaborate. Starting with authority, this is one of the ones where the model law really serves as a template. There's not a whole lot that you can do to modify these sections. This is just pointing out where your authority is in the law to have land use regulations, to have zoning regulations. So you select one based on whether you're a town, a city, a village, or just through a home rule. And then you kind of fill in the blanks. So not much to say about authority. Statement of purpose. This is where you really want to tie your zoning law back to your comprehensive plan. These are the kind of the stock options that are built into the model law template that you see on the screen. These are in the document. You're not bound to these. If you have other reasons for doing this, you can add those in. If you like these reasons, you can keep them. If you like some of these but not others, you can get rid of them. Really up to you here. But the point of the statement of purpose is really to link these regulations back to the comprehensive plan for your municipality. Definitions are where we really start to get into the weeds, as they say. So as the model law exists now, there are 3 tiers of solar energy system. I want to tell you that the new iteration, the forthcoming iteration, is going to have 4 tiers. But I'll go through these and I'll give you some insight into what the new tiers will be as well. So tier 1 solar energy system, that's going to be the same in the new version as it is right now on the screen. Tier 1 solar energy systems are basically things that don't really have a land use impact, which is roof mounted and building integrated PV. From a land use perspective, you know, the land use impact comes from the building that they are mounted on. The adding solar does not really affect that much unless you have height and envelope regulations in your zoning. That's what you want to consider for roof mounted, but typically those regulations are going to be within the broader zoning code anyway, so you don't really need to worry about them in a solar specific code as a rule, but definitely check up on that. But tier 1 have the least impact generally from a land use perspective. Tier 2, what we have in the current iteration is ground mounted systems that generate up to 110% of the electricity consumed on the site, up to 25 kilowatts, or up to 4,000 square feet. 4,000 square feet being when seeker kicks in, and 25 kilowatts being the threshold for NYSERDA's unified solar permit. So this is where we see the first change in the next iteration. For tier 2 systems, we've gotten rid of the 25 kilowatts and 4,000 square feet. And what we're looking at for tier 2 systems in the next iteration is that the system generation does not exceed the load on site. So the reason for that is, you know, it falls into an accessory use if you have a system on a lot that is powering something else on that lot. And that's really what we're after. It has not become a principal use. Solar is not a principal use in that lot. It is not a business. We're not selling the energy elsewhere. The system is in place to serve an on-site load. In the next iteration of the law, that's going to be a tier 2 system, and we're going to, you know, make regulations a little bit lighter for those types of systems because they're typically going to fall into an accessory use category. And then in the next iteration, we'll have tier 3 systems, which are the community solar systems. That's where we really start getting into the heavy land use regulations. That's where a majority of this presentation is going to focus. So tier 3 in the next iteration is just community solar. Tier 3 in this iteration is everything that is not tier 1 or 2. So that's a much wider net. And that's why we changed it. And then in the next iteration, we have a 4th tier. And I've seen a little bit of this in the chat, folks are aware. The 4th tier is for the systems that are regulated by the state, permitted by the state through 94C. So 20 megawatts and up is tier 4 in the next iteration. So we have some guidelines built in there to make sure that folks maintain some local control and have local regulations that will be upheld by the state process, or likely to be upheld by the state process. Going into each of these one by one, not a lot to say about roof mounted that I haven't said before. As you can see, you know, not really impacting the land because the building and the parking lot is what is impacting the land. So we're not really going to focus too much on those, but this is just to give you a feel for how they're set up. The size, you can see ballast mount over here on the left. There's just like cinder blocks that hold the array in place, or we have anchors here on the right. And then here's building integrated, where the solar panels are actually built into the facade of the building. Again, you know, virtually no land use impact there. Tier 2 ground mounted solar energy systems for the current iteration of the law is basically a residential ground mount is what you're looking at. So what you would see in somebody's backyard or their side yard, what you see pictured here, that's about the size that we're looking at for tier 2 in this version of the model law. Again, that did change in the next iteration. So those are going to be bigger in tier 2 in the next iteration. And then tier 3 is going to be more or less the same as what you see here in both iterations. That's going to be community solar. These are all community solar arrays. So This is about the size that we're looking at for tier 3. And then in the next iteration, we have the tier 4, which is the large scale renewable projects. And those are probably going to be about at least 4 to 5 times larger than these pictured here. We also want to consider particularly if your community has brownfields, landfills, or otherwise repurposed land, you might want to carve out a separate part of your land use regulations to prioritize those sites for development. If that is the case in your municipality, I would urge you to reach out to NYSERDA's Build Ready team. They specialize in developing those types of sites for solar or other renewable energy infrastructure. So, you know, what that program is really trying to do is reduce the use of greenfields for solar development and try to prioritize sites that have been decommissioned or are otherwise brownfields for solar development. If folks have that type of land in the community, I would urge you to reach out to the Build Ready team at NYSERDA. You can find them at buildready at nyserda.ny.gov. Pretty simple. Applicability. Another one there's not really a whole lot to say about, kind of self-explanatory here. These laws apply to all systems unless the system was installed prior to the date of passage of the law or modification of an existing system by over 5% of the area of the system. And then, you know, the NYSERDA model has just reinforcement of the state fire building energy codes. It's not completely necessary, but for clarity's sake, I think it's certainly good to say that, you know, the uniform codes, the NEC, all that stuff that are state law, that they still apply regardless of whether you find them in the zoning law. It's true either way, but just for the sake of transparency, it's good to keep that in here. For general requirements, we've got what the NYSERDA law says is we want a building permit, so a construction permit for all systems. We want accommodation of solar energy systems and protection of access of sunlight are encouraged in accordance with municipal zoning law. This is typically called solar access provisions. New York State doesn't have a statewide solar access law at the moment, so that is left to municipalities. What solar access laws do is protect solar arrays from future development that will impede their sunlight. So if I have an array in a field and somebody wants to build a skyscraper directly west or directly south of that, you know, my solar access rights are going to say, no, you can't do that. That's essentially, that's what solar access means. Seeker is required under the rules by Department of Environmental Conservation. Again, Seeker is State Environmental Quality Review. That's its own process. So for tier 1 permitting requirements, again, we're not going to worry too much. We don't worry too much about these with the model law. Do, however, have some envelope considerations and glare considerations. So we want the solar panels to be mounted max 8 inches between the roof surface and the highest point of the system, and the panels need to be parallel to the roof surface, and they're not supposed to extend beyond the highest point of the roof surface. And then also within the fire code, you're going to need access paths for first responders. You can see that here at the roof ridge and on the side. There's space for first responders to get up there if they need to ventilate the house. And for flat roofs, we don't want to extend beyond the parapet, and we're not going to allow them more than 24 inches above the flat roof surface, whichever is higher between the parapet and the 24 inches. That's a pretty good rule of thumb, unless you're in a place like New York City, which has more flat roofs. Then you need to think a little bit differently. But as a rule of thumb, for most types of communities, these will work just fine. We want to have glare restrictions in our zoning. That's the appropriate place to do that. There's a product in the market. Most solar panels are going to come with it. It's a glare coating. It needs to be reapplied somewhat infrequently, but it basically prevents the panels from glaring. Here are just some examples of pitched and flat roofs. just to show you what I said before, 20 on the flat roof side, 24 inches, or the parapet, whichever's higher. And then on the pitched roof, solar panels not higher than the highest point of the roof. And also you need a clear path at the ridge for ventilation. And we don't want more than 8 inches between the roof and the panel. Tier 2, we're getting a little bit more, I guess, a little bit more careful about what we're allowing folks to do. We still want that glare coating because these are going to be ground mounted. So especially if these are by the road, we don't want glint in driver's eyes in particular. So we're going to require that glare coating on all panels. We're going to start to get into screening and visibility. So for tier 2 systems, we want to minimize the view from adjacent properties to the extent reasonably practicable. We don't want our solar panels to infringe on others who may not like the way they look or have other issues with solar. So we're going to try to reduce visibility to the extent possible. Lot size to develop, since these are kind of inherently accessory structures. We're going to the model law says that. The model law defers to the underlying lot size zoning requirements for that district. So for height requirements for tier 2, we've got some suggestions within the model law for different types of districts for height requirements. You can see what a height requirement means in this diagram to the right. That's also why I called attention to the photo of the community solar installation on the third or fourth slide, just to call attention to a 6-foot person standing next to it. So you can see that these things can be 10, 15, and sometimes even larger feet in height. So the model law is suggesting that you follow these height limits. Setbacks, the model law is also going to defer to the accessory setback requirements in the underlying zoning district. That's something that comes up quite a bit in the model law. We're going to see a lot of deference to the underlying zoning, and the reason for that is, we want to treat solar like any other type of development, because for the most part, it really is. So we're not going to carve out too many special exceptions for it, especially when we're dealing with these tier 2 systems that are typically pretty small. All right. Tier 3. So that's where we're getting into community solar systems, especially for the next iteration of the law. It really makes sense to think of these tier 3 systems as community solar. So not the big 20 megawatt ones. These guys are going to be typically between 2 and 7 megawatts. So not the gargantuan guys, but the medium size, I guess. The medium size of the large installations, if that makes sense. But this is where we're going to start getting into more stringent regulations. We've got an approval process recommended by the law as follows. Choose which zoning districts you want to permit the system. So for tier 1 and 2, we're going to permit those in all districts. But tier 3 is where we start only allowing this type of development in certain zoning districts. Application to the planning board should be reviewed for completeness within 10 business days. Doesn't mean approved, that just means letting the developer know whether or not the application is complete within 10 business days. That's what the law recommends, or the template recommends. Folks can change that, I believe, if they wish. Public hearing notice in accordance with site plan review. This is basically what this is describing, including the 62-day period. So again, just like any other type of development, we've got our site plan review requirements over there. And then over on the right here, we've got requirements for approval. Decommissioning is a big one, but I think we're going to get into all of these. So I just wanted to let folks know that these are here. Tree cutting is another one that has come up a lot lately. And I'm not exactly sure why that is, but tree cutting, if you want to limit that within your community, the zoning law is going to be the place to do it. So we'll see the model laws language on tree cutting in a few slides, but if you want to make that more stringent, that's one of the places where you might want to exercise, your authority to increase these regulations. But we're going to go through one by one here. Underground requirements. On-site utility lines shall be placed underground as permitted by the serving utility. This is also in the National Electric Code. We want to, for vehicular paths, we want to minimize the extent of impervious materials and soil compaction to the extent possible. And that's what we see circled here in this image. We've got some access roads to service these two sections of this installation. Signage, again, this is another one that's going to comply mostly with the National Electric Code or the NEC. But we also just want to reinforce those regulations in our zoning. So we want to display the manufacturer's name, safety information, emergency contact, equipment specs, and all of this you want within an area of no more than 8 square feet. And the reason for that is if there is some sort of an emergency, we want all of that information to be in one place so that responders aren't running around looking for it. And then the NEC has more signage requirements than that even, which will come into play in code enforcement. Glare, once again, we don't want to have glare coming off the panel, so we're going to require that anti-reflective coating. Lighting, we want to have a lighting requirement in our zoning, limited to that minimally required for safety and reasonably shielded or downcast from abutting properties. So, if we need to access the installation, particularly for emergency reasons at night, we want to be able to see what we're doing, but we also don't want it so that we have lights beaming into people's windows while they're trying to sleep. So the lighting requirement is just a balancing act for that. We've got tree cutting here. The NYSERDA language is minimize removal of existing trees larger than 6 inches in diameter. Again, if that is a particular problem in your community, and I have been hearing that it is lately, you might want to beef up that requirement there, whether that's just minimize removing of existing trees, period, without a threshold, or however you want to limit that. The zoning is the appropriate place to do it. Decommissioning, this one comes up quite a bit. I want to point out again that NYSERDA does have a decommissioning chapter in their guidebook. If folks are going through the process of drafting solar law, I would urge you to take a look at the decommissioning resources available through the solar guidebook while you're doing that. I think it would be a very helpful resource. And it just goes way more into depth than the language on decommissioning that is contained within the model solar law. But decommissioning, we're going to require it when a system is abandoned and are not producing electricity for a period of 1 year. The applicant, the project developer, shall provide a decommissioning plan that includes the cost and time of removing the solar energy system in the plan to repair damage caused to the property. So that cost is typically going to be determined by a third-party engineer who's going to come up with a cost estimate to decommission the system and restore the site to the condition that it was in prior to the solar development. And that's what we're going to use as the basis, as the decommissioning cost, which then feeds into the financial security here. So that decommissioning cost is going to be in cash, bond, or security formats reasonably acceptable to your municipality. The NYSERDA law recommends that amount be 125% of the cost of removal and restoration, with an escalator of 2% annually for the life of the solar energy system. The life tends to be about 25-30 years. The 2% escalator is to account for inflation. Obviously, this was written in a different time. In the next iteration, we are not accounting for monster inflation either. We're hopeful that things will get back to normal in the coming months or years, however long it takes. And the 125% of the cost of removal and restoration, that's going to be based on the third-party engineering estimate that you get as part of the decommissioning plan. So we're going to take that cost plus 25% just to cover our bases and make sure that there's enough in that fund to decommission the system in the event of abandonment or at the end of the useful life of the system. We hope that we never need to use that financial security because the developer will probably just come and do that themselves. But this is just a safety measure so that in the event that the firm goes out of business or something else happens, the municipality will not be left in the lurch. They will have the funds to remove the system and restore the site. The security is going to be forfeited in the event of a default and shall remain in full force and effect until restoration of the property is completed. This is the language that's in the template, so it really does have some teeth here around decommissioning, just to protect the municipality from dealing with or from having to deal with having an abandoned asset on your hands. We've got site plan requirements here too. These are the ones laid out in the model law. Once again, we could just go on mute. If you're not talking, that would be great. For site plan requirements, these are all within the zoning law. I'm just going to pull out a few important ones. The last one here, signed and sealed engineering documents by a licensed professional engineer, registered architect. That's an important one. We want to know that these plans have been reviewed by an independent design professional, and we want to have that stamp on the application, just that professional signing off on the project. Another one that I like to call out is the property operations and maintenance plan. So what that's going to be is your like grass cutting, site maintenance. Another thing that's come up more and more recently is that some installers are, maybe only cutting the grass every 6 months or so around these sites, so that they start to look a little overgrown, cause problems, aesthetic problems from the community. The property operations and maintenance plan is really how you address that. So you want to make sure that there are a lot of specifics in there about how the site is to be kept up throughout the life of the system. Even specifying things as, cutting the grass monthly or mowing monthly or whatever requirement you'd like. But without having that in writing, folks throughout the state have found that it's a bit hard to enforce. Just kind of some of these aesthetic requirements, like mowing is the example that I like to use, because there was never an agreed upon level of mowing. So good to think about that ahead of time, require that in your property operations and maintenance plan. The zoning law is the right place to do that. And then these other site plan requirements here are all very important as well. But those are in the law, so you can see them, whenever you need to by going into the solar guidebook and downloading the law. So for special use permit standards, this is where we start getting into some of the more powerful restrictions, I would say. Lot size. So the NYSERDA guidance is giving you two from which to select. So one of the options is to defer to the underlying zoning district. So we're going to use the lot size requirements that already exist, or we're going to follow the suggested lot size requirement for each zoning district. And you can see that down here. We have lot size suggestions depending on district. That's also available in the law. Same for height. The two suggestions in the NYSERDA template are defer to the underlying zoning district, or select by zoning district following these numbers that NYSERDA has provided. These are going to remain pretty much the same in the next iteration. No changes there. Setbacks is another one where pretty much the same in the next iteration. And once again, we're going to advise you to either defer to the setbacks in the underlying zoning district, or NYSERDA has also come up with some suggested setback requirements. Actually, the new iteration for Tier 4 has suggested setback requirements that mirror the 94C or ORES process requirements. And there are a few other places for those Tier 4 projects where The NYSERDA model is just going to basically say what to suggest what the Office of Renewable Energy siting requirements are. Again, free to change that. It's not set in stone. These are just suggestions. Lot coverage. This is the big one, probably the biggest change in the next iteration of the law. Lot coverage is just gone. We don't include it in the next iteration. And the reason for that is if you've complied with the lot size requirement and you've complied with the setbacks, then you're automatically in, within reasonable lot coverage standards. If you've complied with those setbacks, that's going to set how much of the parcel that you can use for development. And the reason that we got rid of that is because folks we found tended to be confused by this calculation methodology. So the way the law was written here was that only the impervious components of the system were to be counted in the footprint because it was from a strict land use perspective. We understand now that that's not necessarily intuitive. When you think about lot coverage of a solar array, you're going to think about the area and the perimeter of the panels. That's how folks were doing it. So we ended up basically with a lot of lots where you could only build a solar array on 40% of them. And then you have 60% dead space on a lot. That's what the laws were allowing. That doesn't seem to serve anyone's interest. So again, in the next iteration of the law, we just got rid of lot coverage and we're saying if you comply with the setback requirements, then you're automatically in compliance with lot coverage. Fencing, we've got a 7-foot high fence required around the entire perimeter with a self-locking gate. This is another one that requirement's in the National Electric Code, but we're putting it in our zoning to just reinforce what the NEC is saying. But that is the law in the state, regardless of whether or not you put that in your zoning. Screening and visibility, it's a big part of our special use permit standards. And a bit of this has changed in the next iteration of the law, but not really significantly. It's just kind of a more nuanced read. So we'll just go with this for now. It's functionally the same as what's happening in the next iteration of the law. For systems less than 10 acres in size, we're not views minimized from adjacent properties to the extent reasonably practicable. We don't want to require these systems to be out of sight for everybody all of the time. For systems less than 10 acres in size, we do want to use architectural features, earth berms, landscapings, or other screening methods like trees, as you can see on the top right, in order to achieve that. And again, to the extent reasonably practicable. For systems greater than or equal to 10 acres in size, which are also designated as type 1 actions in seeker. You can use the same visual assessment that is required for seeker to analyze the visual impacts on public roadways and adjacent properties. So that work is going to be required for the state environmental quality review. You can require that for your special use permit too, and take a look at those visual impact assessments. And line of sight analysis, as well as a digital viewshed report, are also suggested requirements in the NYSERDA model law. In screening and landscaping plans, we want to include location, elevation, height, plant species, and or materials that will be used to mitigate any adverse aesthetic impact. Pretty much common sense there, right? If we're minimizing this impact, we want to know the details about how we're going to do that. Agricultural protection, big issue in New York State. You can see that we have grazing down there with the sheep, and we have pollinators over to the right. Just two examples of kind of furthering agricultural priorities or balancing that with solar development. It's also something called agrivoltaics, which is becoming increasingly viable. And that's basically solar panels that are very high, and we're growing crops underneath the array, basically. So we're using the space for both an agricultural purpose and to generate electricity. But in the model law, we have agricultural resource protection clauses. The way the current model law defines that is prime farmland and farmland of statewide importance. Those are the types of farmland that we identify in the current iteration. That is going to change in the next iteration. It's mineral soil groups 1 through 4. That is the new recommended metric that NYSERDA is using. You're certainly free, even in the next iteration, to change back to prime farmland and farmland of statewide importance if that works better for the municipality. But the NYSERDA official guidance in the template has changed to the mineral soil groups 1 through 4. So that's one thing that's changing in the next version. I'm going to follow the construction requirements of the New York State Department of Ag and Markets. I've heard many people say that those are guidelines. They're not. They are requirements, and we have in our law template that you need to follow them. You need to follow them regardless. But again, just good to reinforce that here. And then finally, we've got perennial vegetation, foraging habitat, beneficial to game birds, songbirds, pollinators. Basically, the plants that we put in there, we want to be the plants that the species in the area have evolved to benefit from. Here are just some good examples of balancing agricultural purposes and solar. We've got some more grazing there. We've got some pollinators. Just some images to show, how this type of thing is done. We don't have a good photovoltaic image, although there was a really great report that came out of a project, I think in Mount Morris in Livingston County, a really great report on agrivoltaics that was released there that has some really nice images in it. Getting close to the end here, so we will have plenty of time for questions. Safety requirements, we're going to defer to the electrical, building, and fire codes. Those will apply once again without the zoning law, but we're just using our zoning law to reinforce that. Solar energy systems shall be maintained in good working order in accordance with industry standards. Storage batteries of the solar energy system should meet the uniform codes, which again, they have to anyway. So that's the fire code, the building code, and disposal should be in accordance with laws and regulations. So this version of the law was developed when batteries were still kind of a future technology. Obviously, that's not the case anymore. They are a present technology. NYSERDA has also developed a model law template for battery energy storage systems. I would not recommend that folks have this safety requirement as the only way that you're regulating energy storage systems through zoning in your community. If folks are thinking about energy storage and batteries, I would really urge you to take a look at NYSERDA's energy storage guidebook for local governments. In there, you'll find a model energy storage law just like this law, but for energy storage. And you can build off that for some regulations in addition to the uniform code, the National Electric Code, Underwriters Laboratory, and all of the measures that are already in place to ensure that energy storage systems are safe without using zoning. Also, as part of this series, we do offer a battery energy storage model law training. It's basically just this, but for the energy storage law as opposed to the solar law. So NYSERDA will do training on that as well. Timeframe and abandonment, NYSERDA is advising, and again, these numbers can be changed to whatever works best for the local municipality. NYSERDA is advising a special use permit and site plan approval be valid for 18 months, provided that a building permit is issued for construction or construction is commenced. And we're going to give you the option to extend that for 6 months. Again, the reason 18 and 180 days are emboldened is because, that's just our suggestion. Feel free to tailor that as you see fit. In the case of abandonment, NYSERDA again is going to set that threshold at 12 months. So 12 months of not producing energy, we're going to consider that abandoned, which then triggers the decommissioning clause. You can change that as you see fit as well. And then once the decommissioning clause is triggered, we then are advising that developers have a year to decommission the system, so tear down the system and restore the site to the condition that it was in before the solar development. In case of failure, municipality may utilize the security, so the decommissioning bond, or however, that could have also been cash, just however it is laid out within the version of the law that you adopt. Yeah, so we're going to allow, we're going to utilize that security in the event of this abandonment as well. Enforcement and severability. So for enforcement, this is once again, the model law just defers to your underlying enforcement mechanisms. So we're not adding any new penalties for solar violations with the model law. This is pointing back to your existing enforcement mechanisms for your existing zoning codes, and we're saying that solar should be treated the same. If you want to know what those penalties are in the process of your drafting your law, I would suggest that you do look those up and reference those. I've had to do it for a number of communities who just didn't know what the penalties were. So I've actually had to dig those up and send them to municipal officials. But just like so many things in government and in community relations, it's better to just have it figured out up front than wait until it's a problem and deal with it then. So if you're drafting a law, I would really advise you to inventory your existing enforcement mechanisms for zoning in your community. And severability clause for the law is just like any other severability clause. If you invalidate one section of the law, the rest of the law stands. That's just what severability is. And also, I have a feeling this is probably in the questions, although I haven't been able to check. That also is how ORES works, the Office of Renewable Energy Siting. Folks may know that ORES has the authority to strike sections of local laws that are deemed unnecessarily burdensome. So when ORES does that, if and when ORES does that, it doesn't mean they're tossing your entire law. It just means that they're disregarding that one clause of the law, that one section, and all of the other components of the law will stand. And that's essentially what the severability clause is saying as well. Thank you for sitting through this. I know this is kind of dry. Nobody's favorite topic is zoning. I see there are a lot of questions here. I'm going to say we take a 5-minute break, and then we'll get to questions just for folks that may need to go to the bathroom or whatever. And I also need a minute to read through the questions. So if we want to come back here at 7:18, kind of an odd time, but it's 5 minutes from now, we can start getting through questions then. And I will see folks soon. All right. 7:17. There's some questions in here. I'm going to start trying to get through them. And if folks have more questions while we're going through these, I'm happy to answer them. Just feel free to keep putting them in the chat. And I saw just some questions that we get, more or less every time about whether or not we can share the slides of the recording. Yes, you can do that. I will supply Allison with a copy of the slide deck for distribution. And yes, folks should be able to benefit from this recording as you can. Going to start getting into these questions as it is now 7:18. First one, are there penalties for not reaching the CLCPA goals? There aren't penalties that are written into the Climate Act. That said, since it is legislation that is passed into law and signed, I believe that would give folks standing in court to be able to start litigation along those lines. I am not an attorney, but from my understanding of how renewable energy goals work, that is the recourse there. But no, there are no penalties built into the legislation. And as folks, may probably realize, those goals are pretty far off. So there is also time to build in, penalties and things of that nature as we get closer to the dates where we're supposed to have hit those targets, especially in cases where it looks like we're certainly not going to hit those targets. So the short answer for the question is there are no penalties for not reaching the goals built into the law itself. That doesn't mean by any means that there's absolutely no mode of recourse or no consequence if we do not hit those targets, because it is law. So next we've got, is there a NYSERDA list of vendors that service municipal projects available? For that I would advise you to reach out to Clean Energy Help at nyserda.ny.gov. That email address you see at the bottom of the screen there. So if you have a municipal solar project, your solar developer would be the first point of contact for that. If, however, you bought a direct purchase of the municipal solar project, if it's a capital project, that might be different. If it's a power purchase agreement, the solar developer should be doing the O&M. But definitely, I'm not sure I understand that question completely, so please reach out to Clean Energy Help and we can get you a little more information. So the next question here, do these projects provide any direct benefits to the community? Shane Butler, thank you for asking that or answering that question in pretty much exactly the way that I would have. So Shane's answer in the chat is good. In addition to that, for the very large projects, there's a host community benefit agreement whereby everybody in the local community gets a discount, an automatic discount on their energy bills directly through the utility. So that's a state program that's automatic whenever any one of these large scale renewable installation goes in. And then the smaller community solar installations, those typically that electricity is typically being sent to the community. Next question, large scale sites, 20 megawatts or larger that progress through the 94C process via ORES technically have no obligation to comply with local codes though. That is not correct. The ORES process, Title 94C, takes into account the comprehensive plan and local zoning regulations. In order for a piece of a local zoning law to be considered unreasonably burdensome, the developer actually has to challenge that with ORES, and ORES has to review. And that goes to an adjudicatory law judge in some cases to make the final decision. So actually the default is that local regulations, local zoning does apply through the ORES process, and you have to take action to invalidate those laws. And that's what I was saying when discussing severability. So this is one of the ways, having good zoning is one of the ways to make sure that local community, character, benefits, desires are considered in that state process. Having good zoning is one of the key tools to be able to do that and make sure that you have a voice. in the projects that are going into your community.
What's the consideration if there is no local solar law?
So ORES has regulations. If you go to the ORES website, it's actually one of the few things that are there. So ORES basically has a mega solar law of their own. And those are the default regulations. So if there is, if there's no zoning, then ORES will just use their regulations. If there is zoning, then ORES will take that into account. For the next one, we've got, are there any resources for data that show how much petroleum is used and burnt to build these farms, trucks, construction equipment, ships, shipping materials to the US from overseas versus what is currently utilized? Not sure what you mean by versus what is currently utilized. I'm assuming that means for electricity generation on the grid. Yes, that resource exists. That is in the solar guidebook. That information is there. You can take a look through it and find it basically. For all of those steps in a solar panel, with the clean electricity they generate, I think it's something like within 3 years of generation, they've paid their carbon debt, and from then on are producing just clean energy for the rest of the 25, 30 years that they'll be around. And those figures are actually a bit dated. I think they're from around 2015, and I think that they've improved, the efficiency has improved in panels since then, so the numbers are probably a little better now. All right. And yes, 94C did replace Article 10 for renewable projects. That said, Article 10 is still in place for non-renewable projects, including standalone energy storage projects. So energy storage is not renewable by itself. It's only renewable insofar as it's charged by a renewable generation asset. So if you have a standalone storage unit that's not being directly charged by renewables, that's going to go through Article 10 and not 94C. If you have an energy storage project that is directly charged by solar, so if it's co-located with solar or wind, then that will be considered renewable and that will go through 94C. What is the future plan of safety disposal of solar units that are no longer functional or abandoned by the company that built them? That's where the decommissioning language comes in. You're going to require the company that built the installation to do that for you, and they will give you a financial security to make sure that that happens. Is NYSERDA or NYSO facilitating grid upgrades to accommodate solar generation? No. When the grid upgrades need to happen to accommodate generation, that is part of the project cost. So the project developer and ultimately the customer has to pay for that grid upgrade. So the reason we do that pre-screening, which I'm assuming that's around the time that this question came in, the pre-screening for interconnection on the host and capacity maps before we start drafting the law, that's to see where there might be costly grid upgrades, because more often than not, those grid upgrades are going to make it so the projects don't work financially. Can I give more detail about the Tier 2 regulation changes, how they should affect our plan? Yeah, so the major change here is the difference between an accessory and a principal use. An accessory use, if the solar is an accessory use, that means that the energy generated is servicing load that is on the same lot, or it is directly connected to load. That's accessory use. So whether that's 25 kilowatts or 500 kilowatts, as long as that load is being absorbed on the same site, we're going to consider that Tier 2 in the next iteration of the law. Where you get into principal uses, that's community solar. So there's just a lot, and solar is the only thing on it, and then that lot, the solar is generating energy that is then being sold on the grid. So that's a commercial enterprise at this point. It's not a farmer or a commercial enterprise offsetting their own electricity usage. It's solar panels going up to sell that electricity to customers in the utility territory. So that becomes a business in its own right and a principal use of the lot. That's where we draw the distinction at Tier 3 in the next iteration. So anything that's servicing an on-site load is going to be Tier 2 going forward, and anything that's community solar is for a principal use, that's going to be Tier 3. What about energy storage? So we got to that, as I said before. We do have a separate law template for energy storage. If folks are seeing that come into your communities, I would really urge you to take a look at that template. We also, as part of this series, offer a training on the energy storage law, very similar to this one, and we're happy to do that too. Are seeker requirements being adapted to integrate with the NYSERDA model code? It's actually the opposite. The NYSERDA model in the next iteration is being adapted to be more in line with seeker. So that's how that relationship works. But they were created to harmonize with each other. The next iteration, we're just trying to do a better job of making them harmonize. Is sheep grazing and pollinators considered acceptable mitigation for agricultural property loss? Not necessarily by itself. Those are you have to go to the Department of Ag and Markets materials for that. So they're the folks who kind of have all that information about balancing solar development with ag and the specifics therein. I believe they have a dedicated section to that on their website, but those are questions for Ag and Markets folks. This is, the examples that are in here are just to say that there are ways that people have balanced agricultural uses and solar development, and it's good to think about that when you're designing zoning, because you don't want to put in regulations that restrict the possibility of doing that. That's really why there's an ag section in this presentation. That is also built out quite a bit more in the next iteration of the model law. We're going to have call out boxes that are baked right into the template that tell you specifics and link to specifics of what Ag and Markets is requiring. So that's something that we'll have a little more light, or a lot more light shed on it again in the next iteration of the law. Slope or grade restrictions. Yeah, that's, you certainly don't want to be in a situation where you have excessive erosion or runoff. That is something that can be dealt with through zoning. That should also be dealt with through seeker, through those approvals. But yes, it is perfectly appropriate to deal with slope and grade through your zoning law, even insofar as it may be just a reinforcement of what's already in seeker requirements. We have plenty of things in the model law template that simply serve to reinforce existing laws. No reason not to do that with requirements regarding erosion and runoff. So yes, recording will be shared. If solar farm wants to clear cut and an area to build farm, trees must be less than 6 inch. Yeah, that's what the solar law, that's what the template recommends. Again, that 6 inch threshold is something that you can adjust. These are just suggestions. This is a template. If tree clearing is an issue in your community, you don't have to say to the extent practicable, you don't have to set the threshold at 6 inches. You could make it 1 inch, you could make it 12 inches. These things are all up to you, because New York is a home rule state and zoning is an inherently local exercise. So what you see in the NYSERDA law along those lines, those are just guidelines. It's a template. If there's a need in your community to either make regulations that are in that template more stringent or relax regulations that are, you're more than welcome to do that. How and where are solar panels recycled when no longer functional? That's a great question. So the solar recycling industry is still a young industry. And the reason for that is because solar panels typically last 25 or more years. And the solar boom that we've been experiencing, that we're arguably in the middle of, probably started in earnest maybe around 10 years ago, maybe a little bit more. So for a solar recycling industry to have a shop set up on every corner like a Starbucks, so to speak, there isn't demand for that. So that industry has very much grown according with the demand, with the amount of solar panels that need to be recycled. It is an industry. I believe the closest plant right now is in Pennsylvania. It's in I believe northwestern Pennsylvania. That's the closest major facility. And again, the developers through your decommissioning should be responsible for the end of life of the solar panels. So that shouldn't be something that you need to worry about as a municipality. I understand why you would though. But what we can expect to see in the coming years is that there's a significant amount of money to be made in recycling solar because a lot of the pieces of a solar panel are valuable. So as we start to hit the end of the life of existing systems, we're probably going to start to see a thriving recycling industry because basically where there's an opportunity to make significant money, folks tend to do it. But I think the main reason that we haven't seen more solar recycling facilities is because right now, most solar installations in the United States are just not at the end of their life yet, I think is the simple answer. Yeah, and if you're, just like our model law template, solar laws can be an iterative process. If you've passed a law and you've found that that there are still problems happening, it doesn't have to be perfect on the first time. There's always room to revise that. And typically, from my work with municipalities throughout the state, the heavy lift is getting the first one across the finish line, the first iteration of your law across the finish line. The revisions typically are not as time and labor intensive as that first version. But these can very much be living documents, and you might even want to just make it policy in your community to go back and revisit your solar zoning every 3 years or so, just to make sure that you're achieving the desire or the goals laid out in your comprehensive plan that your regulations are based in. Is anything recycled besides the seal, or is everything landfill? There are so the solar recycling facilities are just taking everything that they can. There's silicon, there's steel, as you mentioned. They're basically stripping it for everything that can be reused and refurbished because there's money to be made there. And then I'm not sure if it's 100% of the cell and panel, but I know that enough of it to make it a worthwhile financial venture to recycle is recyclable or is reusable. And then those parts are resold, and a lot of decommissioning estimates are going to factor in that recycle value because at the end of life of these systems, the panels still contain valuable minerals and things like steel that has value, even though the solar is at the end of its life. I think that's all of the questions. If folks have more, that's all that are in the chat. Folks have more, and it's easier to raise hands and do it out loud. Oh, here's one. What are some examples for raising, generating funds for the security? So it's a bond that typically what we see is bonds. It could also be cash, but it's basically a fund that's kept up by the developer. I think a majority of laws that I've seen and they're decommissioning for funds, they're making a bond, but really it's up to you as a municipality, whatever you're comfortable with for that security. But we just want to make sure that it's kept current and that it's based on the cost of decommissioning the system and restoring the site, and that it exceeds that cost, right? Because the idea for the security is not to use it. We want we want to incentivize the developer to take care of all that on their own. are grants available for the security deposit for the town. So the security deposit is paid by the developer. It's not a cost that's incurred by the town. And the cost of security, if needed to be used, be reimbursed by the state. Again, the cost is coming from the developer. So that's not something that you need to build a decommissioning fund. That's money that the developer is giving to the municipality. I think it's value forced. Yeah, and I think the rest of these questions here just kind of go back to the idea that the security is not a cost that's incurred by the municipality, it's a cost that is incurred by the developer. It's money the developer is giving to the community just to be sure that there will be money there to decommission the system in the event that the developer is not able to. Can sites be refurbished instead of decommissioned? Yes, I said that I think several times throughout this presentation. Yes, we're decommissioning the system and restoring to the site to the condition that it was in before the solar development. That is in the NYSERDA template. That should absolutely be in the language for decommissioning in every solar zoning law in the state. We don't want to stop at decommissioning. We want to make sure that there is law in there that mandates that the developer refurbishes that site. So we're going to restore the site to the condition that it was in before there was any solar development. We're not
By
just
refurbished, I mean, can new panels be installed instead of decommissioning the entire installation?
Oh, I
Not
see what you mean.
Site be restored.
Sorry, my bad.
Can you install new panels instead of having a rolling model using new land every time you need to absorb additional solar power generation?
Yes, absolutely. That's all going to be between the developer and the site owner. But if they and I think it's my understanding a lot of solar contracts have that written in, that there is an option to extend. But yeah, just because solar panels are warranted for a very long time doesn't mean that they're never defective. So it does happen as part of regular solar operations and maintenance that every once in a while you will need to replace a panel, and there is a way to do that. And yes, if the site owner and the developer agree to extend, the use of that site for solar production for longer than the initial contracted term, they're free to do that. It's also worth noting that solar panels are warranted for 25 years. That doesn't mean that solar panels last 25 years. There are solar panels in space, the harshest environment imaginable, that were launched out there in the 70s, and they're still working in space. So, these things can last 50 years longer easily. But 25 years is the warranty, and the contract term is typically tied to the warranty. Yes, should anything happen to the panels where they're not producing what they should be, it is possible to just, replace them. Instead of having to develop a new site. I thought holding long-term bonds for such was ruled unconstitutional. I remember when that was the debate that I think that first came up in 2016. This is something that you certainly want to run by your municipal attorney, and the language in the template says, the security should be in a form that the municipality feels comfortable with. So if your attorney is saying that it is unconstitutional to hold long-term bonds for decommissioning of a solar system, then I would require cash or another form. My understanding is that there was some nuance to that ruling on bonds, which is I think about 5 years ago, if not a little more now, whereby in some cases it's allowed. I am not an attorney by training. I don't know the nuances of that. I do, however, review a lot of solar laws, and I know that from that experience that folks are in a lot of communities comfortable with bonds for decommissioning. Bond is not the only option. One of the other ones outlined in the model law template is cash, and it's perfectly fine to use cash for the security as well. Again, the idea is not to use the security. The idea is to have the developer do it. the security is a fail-safe mechanism. So that's why we're setting the security at 125% of the estimated cost of decommission and restore. You know, there's a 25% penalty from the developer baked in. There's a 25% incentive for the developer to do that work on their own and make sure that you never have to exercise your right to use that security. If the developer is no longer active after 25 years, so we've run into this. Typically, the projects are sold off. So just because the person who installed that asset doesn't exist, or the entity that installed the asset doesn't exist anymore, that doesn't mean that no one is responsible for that asset. A huge example of that was SunEdison in 2016. Went bankrupt, and at the time they were one of the biggest solar installers in the country. And then all of their, their entire portfolio is now just got bought up, and now it's just someone else is on the hook for those installations. So if the developer is no longer active after 25 years, yeah, that might lead to a situation where you're where you need to dip into the security. That, based on experience, once again, that probably isn't going to be the case. There will likely be someone to come in and pick up those assets in the event that someone goes out of business. We're at the bottom of the chat questions, and also if folks find it easier to use kind of the hand raise function on Zoom or unmute, I'm fine with that. It doesn't need to be in the chat. And if there are no more questions, that's okay too. We can just give it another minute or two, just to be sure. But just in the meantime, I really do want to thank everybody for attending tonight. I know that this is not the most interesting possible subject matter. Zoning is a dry subject. I understand that. I really appreciate your sticking through this. Really appreciate your asking thoughtful questions. I can tell by the questions you're asking that you're thinking along the right lines. These are